introibo ad altare Dei.
Welcome to Catholic Conversations, where I'm Catholic and we are going to have a conversation. I'm Adrian Fonseca, your host, and I'm here with Alex Broussard. And we're going to have a conversation about St. Augustine. St. Augustine was an early church father. He's from Hippo, so it's St. Augustine of Hippo. And well, that's where he was a bishop for a while. And we'll talk about the history of St. Augustine, his life, where he grew up, what influenced him, and his conversion, and some of the questions that commonly come up regarding St. Augustine and that kind of thing. Alex Broussard will be a senior at the University of Dallas this coming year. Alex, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Alex Broussard. I study classical Greek and Latin philology and now math at University of Dallas, and I like to read stuff written in Latin and Greek, and Augustine's a great example of that, and he's a lot of fun. And yeah.
So for those people who don't know, what is philology?
Literally it means love of words. So take classics and the things you read for classics and just spend extra focus on the language stuff there.
So it's kind of like someone who studies languages, that kind of...
Yeah.
Awesome. And so when did you decide that you had an affinity for St. Augustine?
That's a great question. I don't know. I don't think I have a particular affinity. I just have an interest in him, and I started reading some of him and started reading more and more. I took a seminar on Augustine with a couple professors from Catholic University of America, and I took a Latin course over some of his some selections from his Confessions, and also his literal commentary on Genesis. And I read a lot of his Confessions for theology and philosophy class last semester. So, since I've been exposed to him, my interest has just grown and grown. And he's sort of one of the quintessential examples of Christian Latin writing. And he's, I think, the most prolific Latin Christian writer of all of history.
Really?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Only, I think, second place goes to Jerome.
Really?
Contemporary of Augustine's.
Wow.
But he's written over 1 million words.
Wow. That's insane.
Yeah.
Well, I know that Augustine also gets the award for first memoir in history.
Yeah, first autobiography, I think, or at least in Western history.
Right. I think that's interesting.
Which is a wonderful read. Would recommend everyone read it who's listening.
I think the only thing I've ever read of St. Augustine is his Confessions. I think I've read that like 3 times because it was assigned to me in like 3 different classes, and so I had to read it. And it was a great read, and I'm like, why can't someone assign me something else so I can read other things?
I guess always do it in my if you want.
I guess I could do it on my own, but when you have so much time in a day. But what's your favorite works from St. Augustine?
His big 3 are the De Civitate Dei, the City of God, the De Doctrina Christiana, on Christian doctrine, and the De Trinitate, on the Trinity. And these are just huge works. And so, if you have 3 big things you want to read of Augustine that are just like monstrous, amazing works, those are 3 you can definitely check out. But I think some of the smaller ones are more appropriate for, something that isn't a 2-3 year endeavor. So, he has writings like the literal commentary on Genesis, which is a great introduction to reading Genesis. And then some other works like his De Libero Arbitrio on free will, which is, I think, one of the most profoundly influential and underappreciated works of Western thought, which really introduces the idea of free will into the Western canon. And then maybe his work on Holy Virginity, which tells you what he actually thinks about his views on human sexuality. And lot of people like to say things about what Augustine thought about sex, and they have no idea what he actually said about sex.
Yeah.
So
I mean, I have no idea, so maybe it's something we can dive into later
Absolutely.
on. But there's one thing I wanted to ask you. Are you familiar, because you mentioned his commentary on Genesis with his angelology?
no, not really.
And so I'm not super familiar with it because I'm only familiar with it through the writings of Thomas Aquinas. Because
Okay.
Aquinas quotes Augustine quite a bit when he talks about his theology of the angels. So with the idea that we say that Lucifer fell and that a third of the angels fell, and that the struggle between the Michael who said who was like God, and that whole idea, and then the creation of the angels being created on the first day when God said let there be light, referring to the creation of the angels, and then the separation of light and darkness being reference to the separation of the angels and the fallen angels. And Thomas Aquinas credits that to Augustine. And I was just curious if you're familiar with that.
There's a lot of his big three works that I haven't read still, and they might be in there. And I mean, so no, I don't really know.
Okay.
I mean, it makes his, as far as I know, his On the City of God incorporates a lot of pagan mythology and tries to explain things. So I think that's maybe where we get the idea is that pagan gods were actually fallen angels or devils, but I'm not super sure.
I think that's St. Paul says, I can't remember. He says that the gods of the pagans are demons, and so that's probably where Augustine probably gets some of that idea from. But let's talk about Augustine's life.
Okay.
Who was Augustine before he was Saint Augustine?
Quite the rascal. He grew up in Thagaste, I think it's the way it's pronounced, Thagaste, which is a city in Numidia. And he was in sort of, I think, the lower parts of the upper class. So he was able to afford his father was able to afford a proper education for him. And he thrived with that, even though he mostly hated it when he was young. And if you read his confession, I'm sure you read his confessions, he took a very long time to sort his life out, and he tried to find work as an instructor, and this ended up taking him to Italy eventually, and that's how he got into contact with St. Ambrose, and eventually at the age of 31 converted to Nicene Christianity as opposed to Arian Christianity, which St. Ambrose was very much an opponent of. And I guess I should mention he was born in 354 and died in 430.
Yeah, that's probably pretty
as
significant.
as the Bishop of Hippo, which is why he's called Augustine of Hippo.
Mm-hmm. And in his early life, he was a very sinful man. And it was always interesting to me to think about like how he was able to become a priest, yet he had a child. Do you know the story behind that process?
Well, I guess it helped that his illegitimate son that he had, a Deodatus, which means given by God, gift of God, he died. Mm-hmm. But he did write a dialogue where Augustine wrote dialogues. He wrote kind of basically in every single genre we can think of.
Do you think that was inspired by Plato?
Oh, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, well, Plato and the Platonists, now we call them Neoplatonists, had a profound impact on Augustine. I think it was On the Teacher, De Magistro, which is how he talks about education and knowledge as a dialogue on that. One of his characters was a Deodatus. But in his conversion, he eventually had a total conversion where he just wanted to devote his entire life to God. And there's a scene of him flipping open the scriptures to a page of Paul where it told him to give up the sins of the flesh. And this was just his emotional breakdown that led him to give up the woman who was betrothed to him and decided to devote his life entirely to not necessarily being a priest, I think, but being a celibate man who had lived just entirely for God.
And then did he, whenever he made that decision, how did he get to that decision? Did God just like open up the skies? It was like, Augustine, this is me. How did he get there?
Well, in the Confessions, he talks about how he heard this voice that was just like, I think it was a kid's voice. He describes it, where it's just telling him, hey, open up this book. And when he opened it, it went right to the passage I guess he needed. And that was his final conversion. His life is, when you read Plato or you read Aristotle, the idea is, if only we know enough, then we'll act good. But Augustine was one of the smartest guys who ever lived. And this was before his conversion. Yet he lived such a sinful life. So if there's an example of this principle being incorrect, where if you just know something's wrong enough, then you'll just live a good life, then...
I guess it's the idea that if no one does anything wrong, that they know is wrong. And Augustine's a example of the fact that that's not necessarily true. If you can do wrong just for the sake of doing something wrong.
Yeah, Augustine, I don't think he knew a guy who was smarter than him, with the exceptions maybe Ambrose or Jerome.
Wow. So he, in his life, I remember a story of the story of the pear tree that I thought was like really funny when I first read it back in high school. I was like, why is that a big deal? And then reading it again in college.
It's very colorful.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Could you tell a story?
Okay. So this rascal, young Augustine, long wavy hair, hanging out with his buddies, they just want the thrill of doing something naughty. And so they decide to steal some pears. And he notes, I didn't need to steal them. I have better pears at home. I didn't even eat these pears. I threw them out. But I just loved the feeling of doing something bad. I loved the bad that I knew it was. I loved the fact that I saw myself falling away. And he would laugh at the people he would dupe and make fun of. But he knew that behind this, there were demons laughing at him because he's duping himself. And he's turning away from God. That's what he liked.
It's so crazy.
He didn't like the pears, but he liked the fact that he was doing something wrong.
Wow. It's incredible to think about, because like how often do we in our lives, we do something that we know is wrong, and then we may regret it or we may not regret it, but we know it's wrong. And we're like, wow, we just did that act, and we can...
he did it because it was wrong. That's what he wanted to do it.
That's crazy. Yeah. And so how did what was one of the influences? So you had St. Ambrose. Who else was an influence on his conversion?
Well, absolutely his mother, who, aside from a few incidents when she was a servant, where she would start to take progressively larger and larger sips from a wine barrel, she would pray every single day for her son's conversion for years. And it took many years because he didn't actually convert until he was 31. But eventually her prayers were probably the most profound thing. And there was the story of, she went to a bishop, I can't remember who it was, maybe it was Ambrose, but I'm not sure. She went to this bishop begging for advice, and the bishop must have gotten annoyed or something, because he rebuked her saying, there's no way that the child of such tears can be lost forever. And so she took hope in that. And I guess he was right.
And speaking of his mother, what was his relationship with the Blessed Mother?
He doesn't write about Mary that much. I've seen snippets of things in secondary literature where people have said, oh, he writes this, or he doesn't write this, or where he does write about Mary. This isn't actually his writings. It's a spurious thing attributed to him. The fact was that he was a Roman Catholic bishop, a Latin father, and the year after his death, 431, was the start of the Council of Ephesus, where they declared Mary the Theotokos, the Mother of God. And so he, in the things I've read, I've not actually come across discussion of Mary,
Interesting.
but yeah, I'm trying to find it, I guess.
Yeah, the other interesting thing is there's actually a claim that he's not a Roman Catholic bishop. I've heard that from many Protestants that he was that the Roman Catholic Church was not that he was not a bishop of the Roman Catholic Church. He was I guess some people say he's a Calvinist. Some people say he's a Lutheran in terms of his theology and philosophy. So how can you say this guy is a Roman Catholic?
Because I look at the alternatives. I mean, Luther and Calvin wouldn't come around for 1,000 years, and frankly, if you read his stuff, he rebukes the alternatives quite often. You have Manichaeism, which he actually tried for a while, but eventually got sick of because he found that their smartest guy, Faustus, didn't actually know what he was talking about. Arian, so non-Nicene Christianity existed, but the guy who converted him to real Christianity was Ambrose, who is the most anti-Arian guy you can get, who, story goes, it's what happened. He was pressured into giving up two churches in Milan to the Arians, and he stood his ground and just camped out in these churches and wouldn't let them get it, and he won.
Wow.
I mean, you have Donatists, who were a group of people who said that the sacraments were invalid if a sinful guy gave you the sacrament. So baptisms who were done by bad people were invalid, which, I mean, Augustine explicitly calls them outside the church.
And that would be this same, because at the time it was the Neo-Pelagians?
Well, the Pelagians were something different, which he also combated. I mean, a lot of people like to say he was Pelagian, which is kind of silly because he condemned Pelagianism. The misunderstanding, I think, on the side of some Protestants might be, or I guess Catholics, anyone who thinks that he was Pelagian, is that he doesn't tell you can earn your transformation. He doesn't tell you can earn your becoming a saint. What he does talk about is the transformative power of grace. He's called the doctor of grace for a reason. And grace is what causes you to become a better person. There's no way that outside of God you can be transformed or saved.
So when Augustine talks about grace, does he refer to grace? How does he quantify grace? Does he talk about it in a quantitative way or a qualitative way? What is his language of grace?
I don't really know how to answer that. There's no grace units or things like that.
That's why it's a very tricky question whenever you talk about God's grace working in someone's life. Colloquially, we'll say things like you have more grace or God gives you such great grace and things like that. But what is the theological language or philosophical language of grace?
Well, I'll give you an example from his work on Holy Virginity. Certain people are given different graces because people live different kinds of lives. But it's not as if there's one great life and all the rest are bad. There are different kinds of graces. So he says that, say, a married couple living chastely, that's definitely a good thing. They are having kids, raising them, being a witness of the virtue of chastity within a marriage. But he says that there are other graces as well, and that there are higher graces, like living as a celibate, like a monk. By the way, at this time, celibate did not equal priest, because you would have lay people who were celibate, lay people who were married, priests who were celibate, and priests who were married. They kind of overlapped. Of course, the greatest grace is being a martyr. I mean, that's kind of your one-way ticket to heaven.
Yeah. So
But not everyone's given that grace.
interesting. And so when you were talking about the Augustine's language or his theology on or what did Augustine think about sex in general and how many people get it wrong. So what does Augustine say about sexual relations and his theology, I guess, on sex or philosophy on sex?
Well, his opinion kind of changes over time, and I guess understandably because his conversion was a conversion away from.
So walk me through that. Where did it start? Where did it end?
That's a really long story. That's his whole confession. That's the whole first 9 books of his confessions. I guess it starts when he reads Cicero's. I think it's called Hortensius, which we don't have, but it's this work on philosophy, and it introduces Augustine to the philosophical life. And in his pursuit of truth, he comes to Manichaeism, which is this weird fusion religion of Eastern stuff and some Christian stuff. And he gets pretty into it, but he rejects it for various reasons. Then he finds a different philosophical school, which is called Platonism, but really it's Neoplatonism as it came to be known to us since, I think, the last century. And he says that in this school, he found every single truth except those which were divinely revealed by the scriptures. And so in his trying to find better teaching jobs around the Roman Empire, he eventually got to Milan, where he was introduced to Ambrose. And he was just amazed by this guy's learning and his, example, as everyone else was. And the fact that Ambrose was educated really helped, because if he wasn't and he couldn't hold a intelligent conversation, he might have rejected the Nicaeans like he rejected the Manichaeans. But he was able to actually get to know Ambrose, and this influence and, of course, the grace of God led him to finally be baptized.
Yeah, because the first time he talks about, first time he read the Bible, he said this was garbage.
Yeah.
He was like, this is not good literature.
And that's a great point. But he realized that this Bible, and he says it in the De Doctrina Christiana, is the most eloquent and holds the most wisdom of anything. So the De Doctrina Christiana is trying to tell you, hey, it's okay to use rhetoric and philosophy, but the most important thing is the scriptures, because that's just the best.
Speaking of which, another thing that I hear often is that that Augustine was sola scriptura. And is there any evidence for that, or any evidence against that, or is that even a topic that even came up at the time period?
I mean, I ask what someone who believes in sola scriptura means by that, but if you want to find a better example of, I guess, mainstream Protestant sola scriptura, you might look at St. Jerome, who was a bit hostile to the, quote, deuterocanonical books, end quote. He didn't really want to translate them because they weren't in Hebrew, so I've heard. But Augustine says, okay, so what he found appealing at first about the Manichaeans was he would point out how silly the normal Christians were with all their weird things they had to believe. But he writes in the literal commentary on Genesis, sort of as a jab near the beginning. These guys tell us to discard the silly things supposedly in our religion, but then you have to substitute their even more ridiculous things, because Manichaeans have all these weird names for different entities and stuff.
Speaking of which, for people who don't know, what the heck is a Manichaean?
A Manichaean is a follower of this guy named Mani. I think he might have been from the 3rd century, but he ended up having this weird mystery religion with different levels of an initiation and all these different entities. But the main thing that Augustine was against in his philosophical writings was the idea that there was a dark counterpart to God. Like, you have the good God, the bright God, and then the evil counterpart. But Augustine then would say, no, there isn't a bad counterpart to God, because God's the creator. Why would he create, and how could he create? I shouldn't say that. I should be more careful with my language. He would obviously, there's no way this being could exist because, I mean, God is creator of everything. He's in charge of everything. And so if there's any evil, it's actually privation, not a positive, not a positive force of evil.
So he was denying this like dualistic idea of God.
Precisely.
And so I guess the idea would be something along the lines of that if God exists, and we look at it philosophically speaking, because I guess since he was a Platonist, he would have the idea that God it means that he must be good, as Aquinas proves in his Summa.
This is getting a bit spicy because the language of the Neoplatonists is very different than the language of the people like Aquinas. Because
the Aristotelians.
Yeah, the Aristotelians. Well, because when the context of the language is different for one, and so when a Platonist following from really early mathematicians like Pythagoras, nice whole integers were good things, because there's a story of a Pythagorean disciple being executed, murdered for finding that square root of 2 is irrational. So because they were trying to get this right triangle with sides of 1, and then they found that the hypotenuse was square root of 2, and it's irrational because there's no way you can represent it with 2 whole numbers as a fraction. And so this is a big no-no, so they killed him. And you can prove it. And I suppose he did.
That's hilarious.
But also with you can't eat legumes if you're a Pythagorean, so no beans or...
What?
Yeah, it's a really weird religion. But the idea that whole was good was profoundly influential, and it got to Plato through Parmenides. And so for the Platonists, what was good was necessarily finite, because a whole number is just what it is to the exclusion of being other things. So infinite things were actually bad. And so when we're talking about beings as good, what we mean is these finite beings, these forms, which are only themselves, not other things, and completely themselves. These are what's good. So that's being. What Plato started to get was this being beyond being. You can see that in...
And that's his idea of the forms.
No, the forms are what comes from this being beyond being.
Oh, okay.
You have this thing beyond that, which Plato kind of gets into in like the Republic a little bit, book 6. Like the sun is sort of the being beyond being, and the things that are below that are the forms. But the guy who really develops this is Plotinus, who was a 3rd century disciple of the Platonic school. And he talks about this ineffable, meaning undescribable, thing beyond being, which is not pure actuality, but pure potentiality.
Interesting.
From which everything comes.
So then, and what's the distinction between saying that something is pure actuality versus saying pure potentiality?
Well, because
when we say that God is like omnipotent, we mean that he is capable of all things. He has potentiality to do all things.
Yeah. So the 3 fundamentals of Neoplatonism from Plotinus, there are 3 what are called hypostases, or the building blocks, the 3 entities, sort of, that's a careless word. The 3 underpinnings, let's use that. You have the one, which is this being beyond being. Then you have the mind, which comes from this. Emanate is the word that's used. And then from that, you get the soul, the world soul, in which nature is in the lower part of. The beings are found within the second part, the mind. It's comparable to the demiurge in Plato's Timaeus, the all-worker. But the point of these beings and all things beneath the one which emanates continuously, importantly, it's not like a clockwork maker, but all of creation, and I think all Catholics hold this to right now, like creation is a continuous thing. If God stopped creating for an instant, it's not like creation could persist without God's continuous creation. And so Plotinus calls the emanation from the one like a stream which never lets up. It's always flowing out.
Interesting. Okay.
And so, but the point is, with these beings, you have a thing which it is and which it is not. This is a distinction. It's a duality. But the one is one specifically. So if you have this distinction, then you really violate the nature of the one. Because knowledge has a subject and an object. So we can't even say that the one knows. All we can do really is approach things through a negative way of discussion. All we can say is the one is not. And
so you say you can. What you mean by that is that you can talk about this one, which we're calling God, in a negative sense. You say that he's not this, he's not that, but you can't actively say that.
Neoplatonists would sort of call God, and just this is an idea that was profoundly influential. I don't want to just say that because Plotinus was not a Christian,
right?
Okay? But a lot of his ideas were extremely influential on lots of thinkers, and it's a via negativa way of talking about the one influenced Augustine. And it was extraordinarily influential on Christian mysticism, like Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, who talked about the via negativa in his mystical theology and his other works.
And so how did all of that influence Augustine?
Well, he finally got to a philosophy that he found self-consistent. And like he thinks that with this he found the truth. So it was something very different than when he became introduced, or let's say people can become convinced that God exists through logical arguments. There are logical arguments that exist. But it's a different thing with faith. You have to have faith in certain things. Like you have to have faith that the Trinity is
The Trinity.
Yes, it's these mysteries. There's no really logical way to convince someone of a mystery. Mm-hmm. You have to believe it. And so this is the step he takes after becoming, well, rather Neoplatonic with the scriptures. Because, to believe that God became man is rather absurd if you think about it from a position where we don't take our own position for granted.
Right. I was talking to a few podcasts ago with my friend Emily, and in it we were talking about how radical it is that God would become man. It would be like if man became a bug to save bug kind. It's just radical. It just makes sense.
And not only that, God died.
Right.
That's just the stumbling block to the Greeks, as Paul says.
It's the scandal of the incarnation. It is a radical thing to believe in. Him being able to take that leap from that point to this point is quite insane. And so once he was here, he ended up doing a lot for the church and founding a lot of things that we live to today. And so a lot of people know that I'm thinking about becoming a Dominican, and I'm pretty sure I probably will apply in May. But the Dominican lifestyle has roots in Augustinian lifestyle. And so the Dominicans got their rule from obviously St. Dominic, who got it from the Norbertines, who got it theirs from Augustine.
Yeah.
And so, are you familiar with with his rule of life?
Yeah, I think most people are introduced to a Catholic rule from monasticism. They know the rule of St. Benedict, which is extremely long and detailed. The rule of St. Augustine, on the other hand, is nice and short and quite simple. I say that his introductory remarks are they kind of outline the purpose of the life. So he says in the prologue, "Before all things, dearest brothers, God ought to be loved." Prologue 1. And then he says, "First, because you are gathered into one, live as of one soul in the house and have one soul and heart in God." This is kind of the purpose of monastic living. You're one community with one soul, one heart, one mind. And what a lot of people might not know about Augustine, even if they did know he wrote a rule, was that he lived in 3 different monastic communities.
I did not know that.
The last one was when he was a bishop. Before that, when he was just a presbyter, as a priest. But before that, when he was monarchy.
Really?
Yeah. The way that philosophical pagan philosophical, organizations, schools worked was that's sort of the inspiration for early inspiration for Western communal living, because it's like the Peripatetics, which were the people who followed Aristotle, the Epicureans, the followers of Epicurus, the Stoics, I don't know about the Cynics, but they all had their own dress. They all lived in community. They all worked, and they all talked with each other. And, so Manichaeans, likewise.
And then, so Augustine, where does he take his influence for when he writes his own rule?
Well, obviously his experience living in monastic communities and trying to incorporate the truths that he knew about the ideal Christian life, which was the celibate lifestyle, which lived totally for God. I should say that Augustine says that all created things can be enjoyed, but the only way to enjoy them properly are to love God first and then enjoy these things as part of creation. We just had a feast day today or yesterday of a married couple who, I can't remember their names.
No, I don't know.
Okay. Well, the thing going around Facebook is like they loved God first and then each other, and because of that, their love for each other was the greatest it could be. And that's extraordinarily Augustinian.
And so since Augustine lived in monastic life, how does one live in a monastic life as a bishop? I don't understand how that works. I mean, I guess it might be different in the 300s than it is today, but it doesn't seem like bishops have that opportunity.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like that. And I think that's something that is a big problem in the church today, is that we've sort of left people to live as stranded on islands, not in community. Everyone needs community. We're communal creatures. I mean, the good thing about living in a mass community is you can spend your whole time striving to be holy, and you have your friends who have the same objective helping you out. And that's the Aristotelian ideal friendship.
Oh, I never thought about that. Yeah, you're right. It is. Wow. I never put those two things together. And I just looked it up. So today is July 12th, and today is the feast day of Saints Louis and Saints Zelia Martin, a married couple who are saints. And you're right. They live the ideal of the first commandment being love God with your whole heart, mind, and soul. Yep. And then the second commandment being like unto it, to love your neighbor as yourself. Mm-hmm. And so, that idea is really prevalent for the saints, obviously, but apparently for specifically Augustine and his rule of life. Yeah.
And in his writing on the free will, in the City of God, he talks about the libido dominandi, and then he talks about libido in the De Libero Arbitrio as being...
And that means...
on free will.
On free will, okay.
So libero, free, arbitrio, arbitration.
Okay.
He talks about libido not just being, like our English term for libido, but libido is any desire for something that's improper. And so for Augustine, a libido is desiring anything over God. And so if something takes the priority in your life, which isn't God, then it becomes a libido. And what Augustine found out was we, as sinful creatures, often choose things that we shouldn't choose, and we know we shouldn't choose. This is sort of our fallen condition. We're tempted to do this. And the reason I said the De Libero Arbitrio was so amazing when I was reading it was the Aristotelians didn't know this. Because if you read the Nicomachean Ethics, knowledge tends to lead to virtue. Aristotle's treatment of what he calls the incontinent man, which is the man who does something he knows to be wrong, he doesn't know what to do with. He just treats it very briefly and throws it away. I mean, what was this will? I mean,
Weird. So, because he didn't have an idea of concupiscence, that tendency towards sin, that are like a fallen nature, original sin.
well, Aristotle might attribute that to someone that's just being stupid, or Plato. You just don't know. But if you educate someone enough, then they would know. Or if they can't be educated, or they still are sinful, then they're just. Plato might say if he believed his own noble lie, that this person was a bronze-souled individual, not worthy to be a ruler. Or Aristotle might say he's a natural slave if there was one, or just someone who's not fit to be a philosopher.
Interesting.
So yeah, it took a long time to figure that out.
Wow. And it just seems so natural to attribute in the Catholic intellectual
We
tradition.
take so many things for granted.
Yeah. That so many giants before us had to build up to the things that we take for granted, especially things like concupiscence and original sin. That idea that we need supernatural grace as well as the building up virtue by our act and by learning, but also, and I would argue most importantly, there's supernatural grace.
Yeah. And this conflict between reason and will doesn't just stop there. I mean, it continues through all of time, and we still have this conflict today, but it came to a big head in the end of the Middle Ages. But that's another story.
All right, so let's move on to something I'm curious about.
Okay.
Because I haven't. I was looking for, and I wasn't able to find anything on Augustine's relationship with the Bishop of Rome. Is that something that came up ever, or was that just not a non-issue?
I haven't read enough to tell you, but the city of Milan was more important just politically and economically than the city of Rome at this time, because Rome had just turned into a total slum. But Rome was still...
Sounds familiar.
But that's why Ambrose was like so powerful. But Rome was, and you can read a lot of different early church fathers like Clement, Ignatius, and Irenaeus. They all talk about Rome as the ideal church, the first in charity. This is the church which is the model because it's so early. It's one of the first communities. 2, it was also one of the most persecuted. So it's the example of the highest of virtues. 3, it is a church founded by the rock of the church, Peter. Mm-hmm. And it's not as if there wasn't a pope, because there was a pope. But they didn't have at the time something like we have today of a universal bishop, because this is before even the Chalcedonian schism in the 450s. Augustine died 430, because you had your schism with the Coptic Church in 450 or 450 something. Then you had your schism with the East formally at 1054. And so, whereas the Bishop of Rome was the first in honor, there were other patriarchs, so to say, in places like Alexandria or Antioch.
And then Augustine's whenever he was in relation with as a bishop to his brother bishops, did at the time of his life did he have a special place in terms of his relationship with the other bishops, or was he just one bishop amongst many?
I don't know.
Okay, that's a good answer.
Someone who did have a close relationship with the Pope was actually Jerome.
Really?
'Cause Jerome was he was told to compose the Vulgate by the Pope. I can't remember his name. And then he was told to keep in, I think he was told to keep in the Deuterocanonical books by the Pope. And so, because of the Pope's control over the West at this time, even this early time, then that became the basis for the scriptures used throughout the West for 1,000 years. And continuing
so did
later.
Augustine have Deuterocanonical in his Bible?
Well, from what I've read of his writings, he used what's called the Old Latin, which is a very badly written translation of the Greek scriptures in the Old and New Testament. So since the Septuagint did have these books, then the Septuagint was treated as divinely inspired. Mm-hmm. I think he would have. I haven't read enough of his writings to see any specific treatment of the Deuterocanonical books. Mm-hmm. But I mean, nothing I read suggests he
denied it.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Go back to what he said about the Manichaeans. The Manichaeans had their own books, mm-hmm. and he just said they were ridiculous because you're telling us to disregard these books held by the church, but you want us to use your own books? That's kind of dumb. Yeah. Like you got to use the books used by the churches.
Yes.
You don't get your own books.
It's kind of how do you say, I guess a double standard. The Manichaeans were having.
It's a totally different standard. Like you can't just call our things ridiculous and then use even more ridiculous things. Yeah, anyway.
In regard to his works on the City of God, the City of God, so I've never actually read his book on City of God, and so it's on my list of books I need to get to. In his book, what is his distinction between the City of God and the City of Man? What is he talking about? Is it heaven and earth? Is that what he's referring to?
Sort of. Obviously, everyone in heaven is in the City of God, but the City of God is those who are, in a way, living as if they were in the City of God. So the City of God, it belongs to those who put God first and live a holy lifestyle. The City of Man, or the Civitas Terrena, the city earthly, is the city which belongs to those who favor other things over God. They have libido. And he says, well, most people outside the church, people outside the church, for Augustine, were in the City of Man. But also there were people inside the church who didn't, in fact, put God first. Mm-hmm. And so
his idea, so did he think that you could be part of the City of God while still here on earth?
I think so. Mm-hmm. I mean, people who are baptized Christians and living the holy lifestyle. Yeah, I think so.
And then that leads to the seven sacraments. Did he write much about the seven sacraments and talk about the seven sacraments?
The familiarity I have with that is his writings against the Donatists, mm-hmm. who were saying that the sacraments were non-existent because they were performed by or done by people who were unholy. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where his defense of the sacrament really shines forth, as these things themselves are special and efficacious regardless of the sinfulness of the person, because everyone's sinful. And so, I mean...
Yeah, at the time period, I know that the sacraments, there were some people who actually argued that there were more sacraments than seven. So there are some communities that believe that foot washing was a sacrament. And I believe that it was around the time period of Augustine where the seven sacraments were officially like, these are the seven sacraments. But it wasn't until almost the scholastic period where it was completely dogmified, where it was like, these are the seven sacraments, no more, no less. And these are uniquely the sacraments. And there you can have things that are holy, things that point towards things that are good, like kind of like icons in the East, where they're considered lowercase s sacraments, what we would probably refer to as sacramentals. And so, that idea, I'm just curious about Augustine's writing, or what he would talk about, like maybe like the Eucharist, things like that. His theology on the sacramentology, stuff like that.
Yeah, I'm really not sure about the history of the sacraments and his writings on it so much. So,
And the other thing is the relationship between Augustinians and Thomists. So what is that butting of heads?
I mean, I'd say it's mostly Thomists who don't understand Augustine, but Thomas himself cites Augustine all the time as a...
Yeah, Thomas cites Augustine more than anyone else.
And okay, so, I mean, you wouldn't have Thomas without Augustine, I'd say.
I would agree with that, yeah.
Augustine is the church father of the West, I think is fair to say.
Yeah, I agree. And that's why I was always confused why there always seems to be a butting of heads between Augustinians and Thomists. Like, what is the disagreement that they have?
Maybe it's the extremely crass, unsophisticated comparison. It's like, well, Augustine is to Plato and Thomas is to Aristotle. When, I mean, the Aristotle that Augustine could get his hands on, he absorbed and used all the time. Like, when he was young, Augustine got his hands on the categories, and he just consumed it and was profoundly influenced by the writings of Aristotle we could get. It's unfortunate that in the West we didn't really have the writings of Aristotle until much later, mostly through the Islamic world.
Yeah, and then many
Islamic and Jewish world, the Arab-speaking world.
Yeah, the Semites. So Thomas in his writings often refers to Augustine and almost as like the authority whenever he quotes anyone. And then he also will use Aristotle as probably two of the most famous examples of appeals to authority that he uses. Yeah. Which I always thought was interesting because Aquinas in a different treatise has also talked about how he thinks that appeals to authority is a fallacy and is one of the worst ways to argue for something. So I just think it's kind of funny how he does it anyways, because he knows that appealing to authority is important, while at the same time, just because someone is authority doesn't mean that they're right.
Well, I mean, I'm not here to defend Aquinas, but I think he normally does so with a reason, and if the reason's not in the writing itself, he explains it more. I guess you're talking about the Summa.
Right.
And so, but in some of his other writings, like his biblical commentaries, he'll cite Augustine all the time because Augustine just wrote about everything, and he also cite other people like Chrysostom.
Yeah,
and I mean, when he offers, when there are different interpretations, he might side with one or the other. But I mean, I think like because he wrote so much and because it was so early on and he didn't have all this craziness in the Scholastic age, we really have a lot of his stuff he wrote, and it was preserved pretty well. And that's why I think he's just like so influential.
Is there things that Augustine wrote that are lost to time?
Don't know.
I guess we won't know because it's lost.
Well, I mean, we know like we don't have the Timaeus.
Right.
I mean, what Augustine wrote, we have tiny sections, so I don't really know that. What I do know is we just have a ton of stuff of his.
And and whenever you're thinking about Augustine, what was something that you're like, if someone needs to know about Augustine, what do they need to know about him?
That he's probably one of the most brilliant men who ever lived and one of the most influential men on the whole of Western Christianity. And
then what are things that he taught that people should know, or people that you would want people to learn about? If you were like, you have
depends whom I'm talking
a few
to.
minutes and you're like, you have a room full of people and you have 5 minutes to tell them about some kind of teaching on Augustine, what would be the thing that you want to talk to them about?
Is it a room of Catholics?
Yeah.
Okay. They should read their Bible more.
Oh, that's good. Yeah.
Because, I mean, the stereotype is kind of true. And the Bible is the ultimate source of eloquence and wisdom. And the inspired scriptures are true.
And so whenever we talk about the church fathers tend to be the living in their time, and we have to look at them in the context of which they would lived in. And so sometimes people will accuse Augustine of being too Pelagian, and then other times they accuse him of being too Donatist.
I don't know if anyone has called him a Donatist, but people have sometimes called him Pelagian.
Yeah,
and I'm careful to talk about the church fathers as
a group.
I mean, if something is said by all the church fathers, without, if one thing is proposed by all of them and agreed by all of them, pretty likely we should take it as true. But there's disagreements between them, and I don't know enough about all the church fathers, but I don't know, it grinds my gears when someone says the church fathers say, like, well, who?
Yeah, which one? Tell me, give me a specific citation.
And, yeah, exactly. And so that's why I don't know a lot of stuff, and I read a lot of things about Augustine, but I'm really hesitant because, like, I'm reading commentaries on Augustine, and they said, oh, well, he said the normal Catholic position. I'm like,
what was that?
Really? I mean, prove it. Like, where did he say that? I mean,
also define normal Catholic position, like normal Catholic in the 300s, normal Catholic today.
Yeah, it's normally today.
And define normal.
Like Augustine was just a normal, he basically said everything we said.
Yeah, and that's
And
the other thing, though.
You find that with Catholics and with Protestants, and I mean,
yeah. Well, the other problem is to try and define what they mean by a normal Catholic, especially because, like, when you say normal, do you mean someone who is affirming the teaching of the church, or normal as in the majority of Catholics?
well, I mean, so a big controversy is the issue of grace or predestination, and I think the reason it's such a controversy is because so many early Protestant reformers took Augustine and they were influenced by Augustine, took him as inspiration, and predestination was such a big issue, especially, well, for the Calvinists especially. And I mean, I have a ton of Augustine I need to read, especially these big three works. I've not read any of them in their entirety. But like, I haven't come across this issue. And then when I read a Protestant who's trying to say Augustine is his, then he'll say Augustine said this. And if I read a Catholic who said Augustine said this about predestination, I'm like, you're just telling me what you're saying you said. I don't believe you.
Yeah, like
citation needed.
Yeah, so yeah, because it's quite common to hear that especially when talking about predestination, to say that Augustine believed in double predestination, that God willed that some people would go to heaven, and God willed that certain people would go to hell through His active will. And I get that's a very intense topic to talk about, especially at a close of the last 5 minutes of the podcast. But do you have any thoughts on that?
I wish I have read more Augustine. I think I'll always wish that. And I don't know how to answer it because I've not come across it independently.
And so what's the next thing that you want to read from Augustine?
The next thing is, I guess I'll probably try to finish The City of God.
How big is The City of God?
Big.
I've seen it in size, and it's like as far as my hands and my fingers will go apart. But like, is it like more than 500 pages? Or
I mean, I guess it depends on the print size and the language.
Yeah. Do you read them all in Latin, or how do you read them?
That's what I do.
You read them in Latin? Darn it! I want to read it in Latin. I want to read anything in Latin. My Latin's so bad.
Well, I guess you can't go wrong reading Augustine, and I think Augustine is probably, after the golden age of Latin, one of the best Latin writers who ever lived. Yeah, next to Jerome, because Jerome, I think, knew the classics better than Augustine did. Jerome had in a dream someone accused him of, he was more of a Ciceronian than a Christian, and that freaked him out for the rest of his life. But like his writing is just exquisite, and it's so good.
And what is there any prayers from Augustine that you like cling to?
I think in prayers, I don't know, but when I read the Confessions, like the opening of the Confessions, like greatly are you to be praised. Like that's just anytime nature or anything just seems extraordinary, and you want to thank God for the extraordinary creation of His. Like that's a good one to go to. But also, I think in Book 10 of the Confessions, when he says something about "Late have I loved you, O beauty so old and so new," like that's just some of the best stuff ever written. And so,
any of the quotes from Augustine that you memorize like in Latin? Or are you just like
I try, but Magnus, I can't do it now because I'm on the spot. Magnus est Domine et laudabilis valde. Greater to you, Lord, and greatly to be praised. Like I try, but
do you go to the Tridentine Mass?
That's off topic.
Yeah, I know. I just thought about it.
I go to the Tridentine Mass. Yeah.
Okay, I was just curious because I'm like, if I knew Latin, okay, because I go to the Tridentine Mass every Sunday, and I'm like, man, it would be so cool to be able to go to Tridentine Mass and like have a really good readability in Latin.
Well, I'd say that. I mean, I don't know if I know Latin. I know a lot of people who are classicists don't know Latin because what we do is largely in schools we only read the the real stuff people say, like, you can't read the scriptures, you can't read Augustine, he's too late. You have to just read Cicero. And then because it's so complicated and you've never actually read children's book versions of Latin before, not that you should read this fake stuff, but you never actually tried to read quantities of material, you never actually gotten real practice in a language, you've ended up only reading a few pages of stuff you don't really understand.
Interesting.
And so, like, all these, I'm just sort of ranting about classics, but these professors, some of them will say, oh, the Bible's not real Latin, not real Greek.
Huh.
Then you go up to their students, give them a random passage from the scriptures. They can't read it. Like, okay.
Like, congratulations, you know Latin.
Yeah, like, I thought this wasn't real Latin. Like, you can't even read this simple stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my concern, especially, is the idea that it's defining what real Latin is. It's been since Latin has been kept alive by the church. And pre-Vatican II, I mean, even at Vatican II itself, Vatican II, all the bishops could only speak in Latin if they were going to present a document.
Yeah.
So I'm like, how cool would it be to be able to have like speakability in Latin, be able to write a speech in Latin and speak it or answer questions in Latin? That's so cool.
I mean, the people I studied with at CUA, both of them could do all of those things.
That is so cool. That is so cool to me. I would love to do that.
Before I met them, I'm like, I didn't think this existed anymore.
Right?
But I mean, unlike ancient Greek, Latin still lives or lived a lot longer.
Yeah, I really hope that there's going to be a resurgence for that, because in canon law, actually, it says that the two things that all seminarians have to learn is Thomas Aquinas and Latin. Those are the two things that are listed. And I'm like, do we do either of those anymore? I guess some seminaries do Aquinas and they do like a semester or two in Latin.
Yeah, it's not really learning Latin. It's a language. You don't know a language if you don't practice it.
Right.
And if you only take a class on it to try to translate, you're not really reading.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I took 2 semesters of Latin and I'm like, wow, I know almost nothing. Very, very close to nothing.
I've taken many semesters and I don't think I really started to get it until I started to just try to read quantities of material, not necessarily hard stuff, but just quantities of material and language, and just try to treat it like anything else. It's not some crazy mystical thing. I mean, the way that Augustine said he learned Latin, because Augustine was probably a Berber. At least that's what I've come to believe. His first language was more closely related to Syriac.
Really?
Well, Berber is an Afro-Asiatic language, which is in the same family as the Semitic languages, which includes Arabic, Hebrew, Syriac, Aramaic, the language of Jesus. Also includes ancient Egyptian.
Interesting. I didn't know that.
And then Berber is another family group in that. But the way he learned Latin was joking around with his friends.
No way.
That's what he says in the Confessions.
What? How did I miss that?
So, like, you don't know Latin if you just try to read this weird highbrow poetry or read this occasional political speech by Cicero. Latin is a language with everything. Consume as much as you can.
Yeah.
And if someone writes in Latin, especially someone like Augustine, if you can't do it, try and keep trying, and you'll eventually get it. People give their kids books that are a bit too hard for them, and the kids learn.
That's so cool. At some point, I'm going to learn Latin. I don't know how, but I'm going to do it. Even if it means just getting one of those like weird, you can read Latin too books, and just reading that.
I advise against that. I say learn a few grammar rules, but jump into the language. Read the scriptures in Latin.
Yeah.
Get 2 birds with one stone. You should read the scriptures more and you should read it in Latin. Learn Latin.
I learned in 2 semesters of Latin, I learned almost 0. And I've gotten probably, I would say like 1% into Latin just by going to Mass in Latin. And by doing that, I picked up a lot of things, learned a lot of words.
Yeah.
I can't conjugate anything. I don't remember any of the declensions that I learned, but I know what the words mean. And if they're put in this order, that it means this. And it's been that's really the way that I've been exposed to Latin and had some kind of idea of Latin at all. Just thought that was interesting.
It's a marvelous language, has such a rich history. I think if people have the time, they should try to figure it out somewhat. There's just so much good stuff written in Latin.
Yeah. I mean, all the vast majority of church documents are written in Latin too. So if you want to read it in the academic sense,
The vast majority of scholastic literature is in Latin,
yeah.
and the vast
All of
majority of
Aquinas.
that has not been translated.
I just found this out, and it really bothered me for some reason. Some of because as you know, I'm more of a Thomist, and so I'm looking at Thomas's works,
Mainstream.
and I have no problem with that whatsoever. But Thomas, there's some of his works are not translated into English. And there's some of it that are still in Latin, and some of the Dominican friars are working on translating them into English right now and putting them online for free. But I'm like, I can't believe there's like these works that literally almost like there's like a selection of like 1% of people that are able to read it, and even less that are actually going to read it.
Yeah, I think that's what I want to do to help to contribute to the church is because it's either everyone needs to learn Latin again or we need to translate documents. And I think the latter is probably what's going to happen. And in fact, someone introduced me to the Gospel of, or as Albert the Great's commentary on the Gospel of Mark, and told me this has not yet been translated into English, and that's what I'm working on right now.
No way.
Yeah.
That's super cool.
It's very difficult. I'm a noob, but so I'm trying to, I think I might make a career out of that.
That'd be super cool.
Might help around church history, whatnot.
That would be awesome. And you'd learn so much just by translating it.
Yeah.
That'd be so cool.
Yeah, I think that kind of thing is more useful than writing about some weird poem by a pagan, horny Latin guy who can't get no girlfriend. Because, there's not just one of them. There are a lot of them. It gets really old after the fifth or so. And so, biblical commentaries that haven't been translated yet, or poetry that people can't stop talking about. I think I know which one to.
Yeah, that'd be really cool.
With.
Biblical commentaries, and maybe some of the scholastic works that haven't been. There's so many scholastic works that haven't been translated. I know you're like, scholastics.
No, the scholastic age is one of the most interesting polemic times of history. So many different sides. Like, I'm not saying I'm on a side or another, but it's so interesting. I mean, that's what we don't understand. Like, people call it a dark age. I'm like, you don't know about the intellectual crazy battleground that's been going on for 1,000 years. I mean, it's such a rich field of history and thought. And then it's nice that it's expanding now to include studies into Islamic and Jewish thought, because we're realizing more and more the importance of this influence on Western thought and how different scholars who were outside of Christendom started to come to similar conclusions that we did.
Well,
at least in scholastic thought, I mean.
Yeah. Well, to close out, is there any last comments or last things you would like to say about Augustine before we close out?
Yeah, I got this little thing of his on the Psalms from his Enarraciones in Psalmos, his expositions on the Psalms. And so in our normal Bible, because the numberings were different back then, this is our Psalm 133, verse 2. And it's like a fine oil up on the head, running down upon the beard of Aaron, upon the color of his robe. And so his comment on this is, Barba significat juvenes, strenuos, impigros, alacres, ideo quanto tales describimus, barbatus homos est dicimus. That means, the beard signifies the courageous. The beard distinguishes the grown men, the earnest, the active, the vigorous, so that when we describe such, we say he is a bearded man. And so that's my apology of the beard.
It's why every man should grow a beard, right?
Yeah.
All right. I always close out with a Hail Mary. Would you like to lead us in a Hail Mary in Latin?
Okay.
All right.
In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum, benedicta tu in mulieribus et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus. Sancta Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostrae. Amen. In nomine Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti. Amen.
Don't forget to like and subscribe to my podcast, Catholic Conversations. Subscribe anywhere that you listen to podcasts, whether that's TuneIn, Stitcher, Spotify, or anything else that you listen to. You can find us on any platform in that way. Give us a 5-star review. Leave me a review and let me know what you think of the podcast. Or if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, soapboxes, negativities, positivities, or anything in between, you can let me know at fonsecaproduction@gmail.com. That's fonsecaproduction@gmail.com. And you can get contact with me also on social media. My handle at Instagram and Twitter is FFONZE. That's at FFonzie. So as always, have a wonderful and blessed week.
O